Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live. Why does one startup succeed and another fail? We speak with one expert about misconceptions behind billion-dollar startups, their founders, and what it really takes to achieve unicorn status. Plus, what job seekers should expect as the pandemic begins to ease. All of that coming up next. Hello, I'm Devin Banerjee, and welcome back to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we're discussing misconceptions about startups and entrepreneurs, but first, a look at the top headlines. Women drop out of the workforce in April. Elon Musk reveals he has Asperger's, and the hiring process sees permanent changes. Let's take a deeper dive into that last story and what it means for those in the industry. Companies are emerging from the economic uncertainty caused by the pandemic, allowing them to bring people back to offices and hire more. Recruiters see a bright future for job seekers over the next few months, and they say that some pandemic changes to the hiring process are here to stay. Joining me now is Andrew Seaman, Senior Editor at LinkedIn News. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Anytime, Devin.
Andrew, when I think about the job seeking and hiring process over the past 13, 14 months, one of the first things that comes to mind is video interactions, video interviews. Are these here to stay?
Yes, just like we're having this conversation now, people have to get used to Zoom interviews and having video interviews because basically companies have found out that they can do it. So in the before times, as I like to call it, basically what happened was you would have maybe a few conversations over the phone, you might have a video or interview or two, and then you were always usually brought in before you were actually hired for a job. But the pandemic stopped all that and forced everything to basically move to video. And really, for the first time, companies were hiring people without ever meeting them. So across the country and around the world, there's a lot of people who have jobs now, and they've never met their hiring manager. They've never met a recruiter in person. So basically, companies found out that they could do this. It works. They don't have as much risk as they thought there would be. And it cuts down on costs. So if you think that companies had to bring in people and they had to disrupt people's schedules throughout the day by, coordinating a person's experience, in some cases, they would have to fly people in from across the country, or they had to send recruiters to career fairs. Now they could just open up a link and do that. So it really cuts down on a lot of costs. So for a company's perspective, it really helps.
Yeah. Let's talk more about cost and coordination, two words you mentioned there. And let's talk about remote work. I mean, this is a hot debate right now. We see companies split. On the whole, Andrew, what is the future of remote work from your interviews and reporting? And I'm curious, do employers want it more? Do employees want it more? What are you finding?
It really depends. And I think what people need to know is going forward that we're going to emerge into a new world where there's a lot of differences from what we were used to before the pandemic. But it doesn't mean that these changes are here to stay, because it's going to take a little while for companies and industries to figure out what works best for them. So right now, it's going to be a company by company approach. You're going to have some that say, hey, listen, we want people back in the office. We want things to resume like they were before the pandemic. You're going to have others that say, hey, listen, we can have a fully remote workforce. It'll cut down on costs because we don't need to have these offices for a bunch of people. And then there are going to be companies that let employees decide. So maybe they have more of a hybrid approach where some people are in the office some days, some are in the office other days. So it's really going to depend on the company and the work culture. But one of the things that I heard from recruiters that was really interesting is that remote work is probably going to become a chess piece in the competition for talent. So you're going to have companies that say, hey, listen, you might have an offer from a company that's offering you something similar, but if they want you to come into the office 5 days a week, here you could come in as often as you like or not at all. So if you think about that, that could be really valuable for a job seeker to consider during an offer.
Yeah, let's talk about that game of chess, as you just called it. Economists like to call the labor market at any given time tight or loose. Effectively, what they're saying is who has the power in that chess game? Who has the leverage at the table, at the negotiating table? What did the pandemic do to that power balance, Andrew? And is that changing right now?
Of course, yeah, and I'd love to hear from any members who are watching in the comments. So, what if you have experience with job seeking right now? Please put them in the comments, and I'll be taking a look at those. But in general, what a lot of people are experiencing right now is probably this weird reality where they are still looking for work, and then they're seeing a lot of headlines about companies that are having trouble finding workers. So, we're going to dive into that next week in the next edition to Get Hired. But really, what I'm hearing from recruiters is that competition is heating up for talent. So before, when the pandemic hit, you had massive unemployment. So all of a sudden you went from basically a situation where there were more jobs than people. So job seekers were really in the driver's seat. They could name their price. They could say, hey, listen, I'm going to need to get paid a little bit more if you're going to want me to come work for you. Then when the pandemic hit, what happened was all these job seekers went into the job market, and basically companies could say, we have our pick of talent. So they didn't have to pay as much. The competition wasn't as fierce. They could pick who they wanted for those jobs. But now, as the pandemic starts to wane in the US and some other countries, companies are going to start hiring again. And that means that competition is heating up. So recruiters are basically saying they're feeling the heat, and it's putting job seekers more in the driver's seat. In fact, one recruiter told me that their clients, this is a recruiter that probably works with individual companies, they actually ended up having to pay more during that time than they expected, because they had to compete with other employers who wanted that talent. So it is heating up, and it's good news for job seekers.
Yeah, well, some terrific insights, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to remind our viewers to follow Andrew on LinkedIn and subscribe to his newsletters, Get Hired and Get Ahead. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thanks, Devin. That
was Andrew Seaman, Senior Editor at LinkedIn News. Remember, for more stories like this, to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed, or if you're on mobile, click into the search box. Now, when we think of billion-dollar startups, we often think of the founders as Ivy League grads whose parents maybe had connections, or young, ambitious visionaries who were part of an accelerator program, the first to come to market with a unique idea. A new book reveals that many of those are misconceptions. In Super Founders, author and venture capitalist Ali Tamaseb spent hundreds of hours amassing data on the entrepreneurs who changed the way we operate right now, and how they achieved that unicorn status. Ali joins me now. Ali, welcome to the show.
Devin, great to be here.
Ali, this was a lot of data that you crunched. I want to just start by asking you why you did it and how you did it.
Of course. So I think a lot of the way we think about these successful startups come from media, right? It comes from the Social Network movie. It comes from what we hear about the stories of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak of Apple. And that creates certain, stereotypes about what makes for a successful startup founder, the way that you described it. As a venture capitalist, it's my job to sort through thousands of companies every year to select, the few that I want to invest in. And I wanted to do this methodically. So I wanted to collect this data on a lot of different factors about the founder's career path, about the education, about the idea, where the idea came from, competition, defensibility, fundraising patterns. And I wanted to see if this data reveals anything. And it's a very hard task, and nobody had ever done this before, because it took me 4 years, all my weekends, all my evenings. It took me 4 years collecting this 30,000 data points, because it's a manual task. And after looking through this data, the results are shocking, and just went against a lot of these stereotypes and misconceptions. And I decided to write a book based on that, and to interview people like founders of Zoom and Instacart and GitHub, and 15 other billion-dollar companies, to add the stories to this data and publish this book.
Yeah. So let's bust some of those myths right off the bat, Ali. What are some commonly held beliefs you think that people hold in the Valley, or people generally hold about startups, that you found are not really true in reality?
Yeah. I would say one of them that was very interesting is that you need to be solving a personal problem. This is a big thing that, if you want to be successful, you need to have experienced this, have solved your own problem. You need to be your own customer. It turns out the majority of these billion-dollar companies, the founders had not experienced this before. And when you look at media interviews, you see, a lot of people try to paint this kind of thread between, what happened in their childhood and the startup they're creating now. But in reality, that's a stereotype. A lot of these successful founders, they looked at market top down. They identified a trend. They looked for problems. They spent a year, maybe 2 years, finding the right problem to solve. And those are the companies and the founders that became successful, that identify the best trend and went in the market at the best time. That's one. The other myth that I busted in this book is about experience, which kind of connects to this first one. That a lot of times when we think of a great entrepreneur going after a specific market, we think of them as coming from that same industry. For example, if we want to invest in a insurance company, we may think that the best founders would be people who have worked in the insurance industry for 10 or 20 years. It turns out not. Only 30% of founders of billion-dollar companies in tech, in consumer technology startups, were coming from the same industry. Even in SaaS, even in enterprise type of companies that sell tools to other larger corporations, only 40% were coming from that industry. Now, this doesn't mean these founders did not have work experience. These founders had on average 11 years of work experience coming inside these markets. However, it was, in different types of companies. They may have to work for themselves. They may have had to work in different types of companies. It doesn't necessarily need to be from that same industry.
Yeah, it's so interesting that on average, they have 11 years of experience, Ali. And you mentioned like in media and popular culture, sometimes you think of these successful startup founders as college dropouts or 20-year-olds. But it sounds like you're saying that maybe a majority of them are like 30, 35 plus?
Absolutely. And it's very interesting. Only 4% of billion-dollar companies founded in the past 15 years were Ivy League college dropouts. There are more PhDs. There are more people with law degrees. There are more people with medical degrees. There are more professors than dropouts. Obviously, there are more MBAs. There are more just people with bachelors. And this kind of idea that, it's only the dropouts from these Ivy League universities that are successful, that's the 4%, but there's 96% of other founders that can become successful. And in terms of age, I think there are two different camps. And at different times in history, if you look at the history of venture capital, this has oscillated, and even in different geographies. At some point, it was considered that, you need to be a gray-haired, person with a lot of experience, being 45, 50. I think there was even a Harvard Business Review article 2 years ago saying, if you want to be successful, you need to be 45 years old or older. And then when you also look at the popular mythology and, what a lot of investors go after, it's exactly what you say. It's the 20-year-olds. It's, they look for people inside universities, people who turn their coursework or project into a startup project. It turns out, I think if you look at the numbers, it's only 7-8% of these billion-dollar companies were founded by people less than 2 years old. The median age is 34 years old among tech billion-dollar companies, and the median age in healthcare and biotech is 42 years old. So it's very different from what you would think they would look like.
Yeah, let's take a moment to say hi to some viewers joining us in the stream. We have Ankit from India, Ahmet from Turkey, Frida from Canada, many more from the United States. So a very global audience interested in this topic, clearly. Let's hear about some more, attributes that these unicorns and these founders share from your research, Ali. Are there certain, threads that you found throughout successful founders and companies that, entrepreneurs in the stream can maybe emulate or start thinking about tactically?
For sure. I would mention three. Number one is about the type of pain point that these founders are going after. There are a lot of different types of needs that you can be solving. You can be going after convenience. You can go after safety. You can go after healthcare and wellness. You can go after building an alternative that's cheaper. You can go after saving people time and making them more productive. When I looked into the data, it turns out these two categories, either saving people time or saving people money directly, basically giving them something cheaper, the companies that were doing this, they were more likely to succeed and become billion-dollar companies. And examples of that, for example, Airbnb. Airbnb, when it started, it was all about being a cheaper alternative to a hotel. Now, a lot of things changed about that, about experiences, and there are now Airbnbs that are more expensive than most hotels. But the way it started was by being an alternative that was cheaper. And if you know a company called UiPath or even Slack, a lot of tools that we use in work that save us some time and make us more productive, these are the type of companies that also became more successful in the enterprise. The second attribute is about being a painkiller versus a vitamin pill. So there's this saying, and it's correct, that be a painkiller rather than a vitamin pill. So it turns out the majority of these billion-dollar companies, they're taking away a well-defined pain rather than adding something more, rather than giving a benefit. However, about 30% were vitamin pills. And the companies that created a habit, created a sticky habit, created a community, and created a brand, these are also successful. So if it's a media company or it's an entertainment company that creates a community and brand, those are more successful to win. And the third one, and that's the main one that I find in the book, is the concept of a super founder. And this basically goes back to the idea of hustling. So, trying a lot of different things, not getting tired by failure. We've heard about this, but also the data shows us that a lot of things don't matter. Age doesn't matter. Being non-technical or technical doesn't matter. Coming from that industry doesn't matter. When you look at these successful entrepreneurs, you see more than 60% of them, they were not first-time founders. They were on the second time or third time or fifth time, even 10th time, trying to start a company. That's number one. And in each of these companies, they learned something. They were the CEO or a founder, and they took some connections and resources from that. The people who were able to sell something, to create some value, even if that was small, they were 350% more likely to start a billion-dollar company next. Let me give you some examples. You probably know about Stripe, this $80, $100 billion company in the financial technologies. And their founders are like 19 years old when they started this. So you would assume they were first-time founders. They were not. Before Stripe, they had started this company called Automatic. It was an auction management tool for sellers on eBay. And this company was acquired by $4.5 million. So a small outcome in terms of venture capital, and then starting their tens of billions of dollars of company. Founder of Spotify, before creating this amazing massive company, he had sold a company for $1 million. If you look at international examples, the founder of Careem in the Middle East, the founders a lot of companies in Turkey or in Asia, they share the same traits. One of the best examples of this I share is the founder of Calm. This is a meditation app that he created a website. It is back in 2005, and he put a bunch of pixels on that the advertisers could buy, and he made $1 million. That's it. Like, it wasn't a big success. It wasn't a company. It wasn't acquired. He just created something. He made $1 million off that, and 5 years later, he started a $2 billion company. So that's the trait you see among a lot of these founders, even in Zuckerberg, even in Bill Gates. Before their big company, they had created value. They had sold something.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because we only start hearing about them when they have that successful venture or that successful startup, and we don't see all the work that went into it, all the experimentation that went into it previously. Ali, for entrepreneurs in our audience, and we have many joining us in the stream, I'm curious what's something maybe tactically or strategically they can start thinking about or embrace right now based on your research?
The best preparation to start a billion-dollar company is to start a company that you sell for small. The best preparation for that is to start a side hustle, start a nonprofit, to start leading something. If you're in school, if you're in high school, start a project, start selling something online or offline, it doesn't matter. Just get into the habit of creating value and making some money, even if that's small, from side hustles. That's the best preparation to start going and building a billion-dollar company. And people who've done that were more likely to start billion-dollar companies than people who grew on the career ladder in large companies, than an executive in Google or Facebook. The people who had that hustle and created and actually made some money by selling something small, they were more likely. So start, forget all the myth, start building, ideating, selling, and repeat this, and you'll be on your path to become a super founder.
That's fascinating. Let's talk about the funding landscape. Ali, you are now a venture capitalist. How have the implications of your research, or what are the implications of your research for investors, for yourself as a venture capital investor, for example?
Of course. So I think, venture capital as an industry, a lot of people, we are funding the cutting edge technologies, but inside the industry, we don't use that many tools. It's a lot of our decisions are based on gut feelings. So I hope this kind of book pushes the industry a little bit ahead on using data and frameworks for making decisions on funding startups. And it turns out data is not going to strengthen stereotypes. It will actually bust some of the myth and maybe create a more equal funding landscape for founders of different backgrounds. So the way I think it changed my mindset is not to let some of my preconceptions about a market, about a stereotype of a founder, or where the idea has come from, to come in the way of backing and investing in an exceptional founder, an exceptional idea. And I think that's the best thing that you can do if you reduce your biases and not let your own preconceptions come into the way of making a great investment. That's one. Number two, it's on being able to put different deals and opportunities. It's basically a decision-making process with a framework of data that you can put them into context and you can compare and say, this company A has 3 places that has to go against the data, has 3 ways that it has to go against the odds. And then there's a company B that needs to go against the odds at 5 different locations or 5 different data points. And I'm going to choose company A because that's probably more likely to become a billion-dollar company.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Ali, that you mentioned busting biases, putting biases aside, using more data-driven approaches. One bias that is always so important to discuss is around entrepreneurs of color or entrepreneurs from different backgrounds than the quote-unquote successful ones that we've seen so far. Have you done any research into entrepreneurs and founders of color?
I have not. I did not want, obviously, we know even now, even today in 2021, it's the minority of founders that unfortunately, because of, historical biases that have existed and the opportunities that have existed, is not good. So I didn't want to strengthen any of these stereotypes. However, when you look into the data, you see some of these trends are starting to improve from back in 2005. If you compare 2005 to 2018, there are some of these things that you see that are improving. I think the biggest thing that I hope improves is, a difference in the historical, socioeconomic background of these founders. A lot of these founders were able to take risks. We shouldn't forget the privilege that they had, that they didn't have to pay student debt or didn't have to think about that they could start companies and they could fall forward if they fail. And I think if there's a way to help more people with different socioeconomic backgrounds to come forward and start companies, that's when we will see more and more, less and less bias, and more companies started by people of color, by women, and a lot of other different people.
Yeah, interesting. I'm curious, Ali, what surprised you most from your research? Are there things that to this day, even after you've spent years looking through this data, still are very counterintuitive to you in your day-to-day experience?
Yeah, 85% of billion-dollar companies, when they started, they had competition. Now, when you ask a lot of founders, when you ask a lot of people that are starting companies, like, who else is building this? Who else is competing with you? They will try to tell you nobody. And that's not a good sign. 85% of billion-dollar companies had competition. It's important who is competing with you. If it's an old, big company, it's an incumbent, you're actually lucky because they have taken the time to educate the market, and it shows that it's a massive market already, and you can use their inefficiencies to go and create a big company for yourself. The worst case, it seems like, it's when you're copying just another startup who had just raised a lot of funding. That's where these copycats were less likely to become billion-dollar companies. But if you're going after a massive industry that has some old players from 30, 40 years ago, or it's a fragmented market, there's 20, 30 players each with 3-4% market share, those are the best markets to go and disrupt.
Ali, I just want to say the stream is getting a lot of good advice from this chat. They're very excited. We have Carlos from Texas, Walter from Georgia, Dan from Massachusetts. Frida in the chat says that success comes from simple thinking, but with a good strategy, good execution. Carlos says that developing co-investing partnerships through events, hybrid events, can also help young founders raise attention and capital. Thank you for that advice, Carlos. Ali, I want to ask you about your own path. I found it a little bit interesting. You were a scientist turned entrepreneur yourself, now turned investor. What caused you to follow that path yourself?
Yeah, I guess at every point it was what I was passionate about. And I think at different ages or different parts of my career, there were a lot of different things that I cared about. So it started from, a love for brain-computer interfaces and human-computer interaction. And that caused me to go into science and to be one of those academics who goes to journals and publications and conferences, writes papers, and that was my life. And then from that, I came towards an idea for a startup company that I had, which kind of pivoted later on and became, a technology for industrial wearables. And that took me towards the entrepreneurship path. And I took, years developing a team and, raising millions of dollars and generating millions of dollars of revenues. And then, I think that that's a natural step, or one of the steps that, former entrepreneurs normally take to go on the venture capital route, to then help and invest in the entrepreneurs that come right after them, and to be able to, create leverage for themselves on a larger scale.
Ali, I want to ask you a little bit about the early stage venture capital market. A lot of people are talking about, and if you just look at the data, the seed stage rounds, those first stages are really exploding in size. Do you think that the connection is lost between like the ability to raise money and the promise of being successful? Has that correlation kind of broken down? Can anyone easily raise money right now?
I mean, it's certainly true. There's a lot more money now, and there's a lot of different reasons for that on the macroeconomic scale, from the interest rates and a lot of different things. But the good thing is, a lot of amazing entrepreneurs are starting companies as well. So when you look at you're not lowering the quality of the founders, at least what I see in the market, by investing in more and more dollars, or by investing in more companies. So I'm glad. I think this situation has created an environment that a lot of people are taking the risk to go out and start companies, and there's now more money in the early stages to help more founders and more companies to start. I do not think this breaks any of the existing patterns in the book, or the patterns that I've studied. However, it's certainly possible that the valuations now are maybe too high or frothy, or just too much money. There might be a correction to this market like everything else. But I don't think that matters at the end of the day for people who aim to start massive companies. And they may get stuck in a wrong market and they can start later time. But as I discuss in the book, it's all about this experience of learning something from your first company and then going and applying that in the second one, and on and on.
Well, some fascinating takeaways, a lot of counterintuitive misconceptions. I was just reading a list of 100 misconceptions from your book before this, Ali. We discussed just a couple, so I would encourage viewers to go out and check out the book to see that entire list. Ali, thanks so much for joining us today.
I was glad to be here. Thank you, Devin.
That was Ali Tamaseb, author of Super Founders: What Data Reveals About Billion-Dollar Startups. And don't forget to join us tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live. My colleague Caroline Fairchild will speak with the CEO of Service Cloud at Salesforce about the changing needs in customer service. I'm Devin Banerjee. Thanks again for watching LinkedIn News Live.